Okay, folks, we're ready to get started. Everybody, take your seat, relax. And I'm Lou Alfonso from the EAC Educational Seminar Committee. This is the second day of our series. As you know, we had three great speakers yesterday, and today we'll be following it up with three additional. So let's get started. For our first speaker today, we have Dr. Ronald Bruce Gammill. Ron is a native of Louisville, Mississippi, which is a small town in the center part of the state. He received his BS degree in chemistry from Millsaps College in 1973 and has a PhD in synthetic organic chemistry from the University of South Carolina in 1976. He has a National Institute of Health postdoctorate fellowship at the University of Pennsylvania at Pittsburgh that he received in 1977 before he joined the Upjohn Company in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Ron was one of several distinguished scientists at Upjohn, and he finished his career as a research advisor with Pfizer in Groton, Connecticut. Dr. Ron has published numerous papers in peer-reviewed scientific journals. He has presented numerous lectures at universities, national and international meetings, and he has also chaired and organized international scientific meetings. He holds numerous U.S. and foreign patents in therapeutic areas such as cardiovascular, antibiotics, central nervous system disorders, AIDS, and diabetes. Ron and his wife, Martha, who is an intellectual property attorney, and I had a nice chat with her a little while ago because I practice law, but not in such a wonderful area as she does. I do horrible divorces, and I'm pretty much done doing those now. But she's an intellectual property attorney, and both Ron and his wife, they're enthusiastic historians and numismatists. They particularly enjoy genealogy, Greek and Roman coinage, 18th and 19th century U.S. copper coinage, early U.S. half dollars, which I know Martha really enjoys, and U.S. and world medals. They enjoy travel, watercolor, painting, a Dutch warm-blood horse, and 5 wonderful, energetic grandchildren. And that'll keep you young, I'll tell you. They currently reside in the small village of Schoolcraft in southwest Michigan, where they enjoy sitting on their front porch, visiting with neighbors is still a particularly enjoyable pastime. And I know while they're there on the front porch, they like looking at their coins. You like looking at your half dollars, you like looking at your large cents. So let me go ahead and at my pleasure introduce Ron. Go ahead, Ron.
So I think with that introduction, I'm going to change my topic, the total synthesis of strychnine. No, it's a pleasure to be here and to share with you something that John Kunar and I have been playing with for the last 2 years. And that is on the subject of the Lafayette Counterstamps of 1824. And it's not just Lafayette, it's illustrated here, it's Washington, and Lafayette. Before I get into those details, I want to put out a word. Jack and I have uncovered so much interesting information that we decided to write a book. There was not a book describing the medallic works related to Lafayette, particularly on his revisit in 1824-25 and until his death. We're very fortunate. Leanna Spurrier is going to be our editor. She will keep us in bounds. And hopefully this will be completed by the end of the year. So just a little plug for that. Like I said, Jack and I have been working on this project. In 2022, Jack made a presentation at the NMP portal facts and misconceptions concerning the medallic issues during Lafayette's visit. Then the following year, we were fortunate to have the cover story in the Numismatist, and that was entitled Overlooked Collectibles from General Lafayette's U.S. Tour. And I'll touch a little bit on that overlooked aspect. We've also connected with the Gazette of the American Friends of Lafayette. Now, these are folks that are not so interested in the medallic issues, but history-wise, they are loaded. And so we're in the process. We published the first paper of a trilogy on Lafayette, and trying to blend the medallics with a little bit of his history and what was going on at the time. The two most familiar items, and Dave Bowers has been interested in this topic since the 50s. But if you Google or look up the Washington Lafayette counterstamp, you're going to pick up these two items: the counterstamps themselves, and then these smaller medalettes. There are about 40 known counterstamps, and that's on half cents, large cents. I think there's a quarter, and then 6 or 7 on half dollars. The half dollars are interesting because the majority of them are dated 1824. And of course, that's the year that he was making his return visit. There are no 1824 large cents that were counterstamped, and we can talk about that a little bit later. The medalettes, so far we have uncovered 24, and I'm sure there are a couple that we haven't found. The last one that we identified popped up on eBay. I could not believe it, and I wound up purchasing it, and found out a little bit of the history. And it actually belonged to the gentleman's grandfather, who was a collector beginning in the late 1890s. So some of these have been squirreled away and probably in jewelry boxes. My introduction was Steve Hayden. About 25 years ago at a Michigan State show, I stopped by Steve's table. He knew I enjoyed large cents, and he showed me this coin. And I looked at it, and I thought, wow, what a nice host coin. That's really a nice 1818. Lafayette and Washington, two historical figures. There's got to be a story there somewhere. The other thing that was kind of intriguing was the counterstamp was on both sides. And that's unusual for the counterstamps. Most of the time you find it on one side, and it's either initials or a name. There are some with portraits on them, but they're not very plentiful. So I bought it, and like I say, very interesting, and one day I'll have time to study. Well, in 2020, Jack was working on his 1816 large cent book, and I was doing some proofreading for him. And in January of 2021, I pull out my 1818s, and I'm just going through and reviewing them. And I come across that N2 with the counterstamp. I called Jack and I said, Jack, I know you've got one of these because it was in your book. Send me a picture. And this is what he sent, and this is what I had remembered. You see the top of Washington's head. You see the host coin. The lettering from the host coin is showing up there. Boy, this raised a lot of questions. The foremost is what's going on. Is the die broken? Is it the strike? What is the what's the deal? And that's somewhat better picture. It compares my 1818 with his 1816. And the more we looked at these, the more confusing we found ourselves. This is a little larger picture. If you look between the E and the R, you'll see a die break, and John Wright was kind enough, after talking to him for a while, he sent me this picture of an 1816. This is an N8, and you see that die crack. So, you know, it became more and more interesting. So what was going on, it is a strike-related phenomenon, okay? And I'm not going to go into that today. But there are other examples of this counterstamp where you can see the underlying, not just lettering, it depends on the position of the host coin and how it is stamped. But we got curious about, well, who made these dies, and how many are there? I mean, was it just one set of dies, or were there multiple dies, and, you know, do they all look like that? And then the more we read, you know, there's this thing called conventional wisdom, and this is a double-edged sword. Conventional wisdom in the case of these dies is that they were attributed to Charles Cushing Wright, very, very well-known medalist. And the attribution we attribute to John F. McCoy in his 1864 sale. He has several of these. Not only does he have the 1818, and this is not the same 1818, I've not made that connection yet, but he had the counterstamp. He had a uniface 14 millimeter medalette. He had the actual medalette where it was stamped on both sides, and then he had the Lafayette. I asked someone yesterday, so who gets the attribution? Is it the cataloger, who was Woodward, or is it McCoy? And at the time, Woodward had only been doing auctions for 2 years. I think this may have been about his 4th auction. McCoy had been collecting for quite a while. And this slide just kind of gives you an idea of the contemporaries and the time frame. But McCoy was certainly one of Wright's contemporaries. Big difference in the age, but still, I'm quite confident that McCoy knew what he was doing. He had an incredible collection in this 1864 sale. And then, interestingly enough, as we were reading, like I said, Dave Bowers goes back to the mid-50s in his interest in these things. And in 1993 in Pennywise, he publishes a paper and he says, I have positively identified that portrait as being the work of Charles Cushing Wright. His confidence was in the portrait on the right, which is an unfinished medal by Wright that is listed in Snowden's book of 1861. The material that was in the Mint collection. And so Mr. Bowers connected the two, and that's where he did his identification or his attribution. But the more you read, all of a sudden we're finding in 1999 and 2000, a fellow by the name of John Kleberg has concluded that a fellow by the name of Joseph Lewis, who is a New York City entrepreneur and engraver, was the one who made the dies. This was first published by Kleberg in an oral presentation in 1999. And then he had an article in the Commemorative Trail in 2000 entitled The Washington and Lafayette Counterstamp of 1824, which is the work of Joseph Lewis and not C.C. Wright. Okay, well, Bowers in 2000 published a little paper in the PCGS Facts, And he says, since writing the above article, the 2000 paper, I've learned that Dr. John Kleberg will be giving a presentation on Lafayette at the Coinage of America's Conference, American Numismatic Society, in 1999, and I have sent him much material, information. I wonder what that was. Then in the MCA advisory in 2008, so we're jumping ahead a little bit, Bowers stated that everybody and his brother, including me, attributed the counterstamp to C.C. Wright. Then at COAC in 1999, John Kleberg cited chapter and verse that John Lewis, here's a key, a name unfamiliar to me, did that work. Conventional wisdom changed overnight. Now, I don't know how many historians are in the room, but conventional wisdom is really a double-edged sword. I mean, who said it? You know, what was the database? And why has it maintained its position? And that was one of the questions that, you know, we were beginning to ask. Well, what was Kleberg's logic? Kleberg's attribution to Lewis was, number one, that Lewis in 1824 New York Times, or not New York, New York Inquirer, I think would be the right newspaper, published the most advertisements. Okay, so if you have the most ads, you made the coin, or you made the counterstamp, or the die. There was also a lack of signature on these medalettes and these counterstamps. Well, after doing a little more reading, our question became, well, where are Lewis's medalettes? Where are his medallics? And did he sign them? There's no evidence of any of that. And letter punches. Letter punches are different than those found on the Erie Canal medal. It wasn't quite clear where this was coming from, but the letter punches for the Erie Canal medal were by Richard Trested and not Charles Cushing Wright. So there's a couple of disconnects we can't quite rationalize. And then finally, the portrait of Lafayette on the Scoville button, which is another interesting little story, which was signed by Mr. Wright, was different. That button had an aged portrait of Lafayette. It was what he looked like in 1824, 1825. Very different than this young portrait that you see on the other examples. But the most perplexing thing that we found was, as we read Kleberg's article, we got confused. And it turns out that in all of the 1824 advertisements by Lewis himself, Lovett, Stout, Philadelphia advertisements by Anners and a whole group of others, Kleberg thought they were describing the Washington Lafayette medalette, and they were not. All of those advertisements were describing something different. And that's what this something was. It was actually an oval, gold and silver, Lafayette medallion. And that's kind of the topic that our numismatist article was on. So in fact, Kleberg had misinterpreted this entire advertising scheme and did not recognize that what was being advertised was the medallion and not the medalette. Here's an example of the silver. These particular medallions were the badge medal for the Castle Garden celebration when Lafayette arrived in New York, and our attribution is to Richard Trested and his apprentice, James Bell. Joseph Lewis he actually played a very, very important role here, and that if you read his advertisements, he doesn't say that he made them. He doesn't say he created the dies. But he is telling you that they are exquisite miniature likenesses in medallion. They're in fine gold and silver. Then let's see, this was the advertisement that Lewis did, basically saying that the Castle Garden Committee purchased these medallions from him, and they were to be used as the badge medal. And I think this is where a lot of the confusion begins. Once again, just because you are selling them does not mean that you made them. Jack likes to refer to your local car dealer that you go and buy your car from, and he did not make your Chevrolet. He is selling your Chevrolet. And there was another interesting piece of information. Mr. Lewis, I mean, this guy was quite an entrepreneur. I mean, this guy was incredibly wealthy. His business was import, export. He had connections all over the country. I mean, we have found advertisements for these medallions in Charleston, South Carolina, in New Orleans, even in small newspapers in Alabama, advertising these medallions. But he wrote a letter to Thomas Jefferson basically trying to solicit his endorsement. And what we learned from this letter is, number one, they were made in New York City. At least that's what Lewis says. But he didn't take credit for it. And I have a feeling, knowing what I know about Joseph Lewis, if he'd made them, he would have told you. There were a number of advertisements that kind of fine-tune what these things actually looked like. And Robert Lovett was one of the ones, and Lovett, stone and metal, seal engraving expertise. J.D. Stout, another silversmith, an engraver, better known for his maps, basically describes a miniature medal in medallion in full, whose name in full around the head, which are gold on one side, silver on the other, and they've been expressly for the Castle Garden Committee, which is to take place on the 10th, but that actually was rained out, and it was a little bit later. And they are the badge and medal, the badge jewel for that celebration. So we have a pretty good detail description. Kleberg said in his 2008 paper that the descriptions in the newspaper were not adequate. And so he kind of let those dangle until he found the advertisement he was looking for. And that was this. Well, not this one, one more. Lewis, I think, had a very good friend in Philadelphia who was in the same business. His name was Thomas Anners. And here's an advertisement that Anners read. Lafayette gold and silver medals just received from New York, a large supply of the above medals of the most approved pattern of the same kind as worn at the castle or at the Grand Fete at the Castle Garden. Upwards of 2,000 of these were sold in 10 days. We take that number with a grain of salt. I mean, we really don't know how many. You know, this is a newspaper advertisement, and Jack and I have gone back and forth. Well, how many were there? If there were so many, why do we only have evidence of 4 or 5? Maybe they were just viewed as jewelry, But this was in anticipation of the ball that was going to be held in Philadelphia when Lafayette arrived there. Now, this was kind of interesting because Thomas Ashe and George Mason were booksellers. and their residence was 139 Chestnut Street, which just happened to be adjacent to Thomas Anner's, 141. Ash and Mason ran a number of advertisements in the Philadelphia Inquirer, and they all say the same thing. Lafayette medals of gold and silver, having on them impressions of Washington and Lafayette. And I think this is what Kleberg was looking for, because as soon as he reads this advertisement, all the other advertisements seem to disappear. And so it's the Ash and Mason advertisement that has him convinced that these were Lewis's. Like it says, the New York and Philadelphia advertisements, were these medalettes, but they were not. We believe that this medalette was actually the Philadelphia badge and medal, and it was created by Wright with the help of Richard Trested and James Bell. So, after about a year of this, you kind of say, well, who do you believe? And 135 years of conventional wisdom or John Kleberg. We have found absolutely no evidence that Joseph Lewis was a medalist. We have found no evidence that he ever created a medal, a medalette, or signed anything, which is really kind of peculiar, because he was a great advertiser. He was a great entrepreneur. But we just cannot find any evidence that that Lewis had anything to do. I mean, he sold engraving materials. I mean, he was selling stuff to the engravers. He was importing that material from England and from France. So he was kind of in that business. Okay, so Kleberg puts this reattribution out, and what's the inclusion from the catalogers? And I'm not trying to pick on catalogers. Borkhart's not here, right? Okay. But if you look at Stax, Stax has handled by far the most counterstamps and medalettes. From 2004 to 2023, 63% of their attributions have been to Lewis. 9% go to Wright. And 11% go to Wright and Lewis. How do you do that? When you describe the medal or the medalette, you list both the Massanti number and the Baker number. Okay? Baker says Wright, Massanti says Lewis. Okay, so the way the catalogers were kind of squeaking through this was, we'll just call it, I mean, it looks good, right? You've got two nice references, but they indicate two very different things. Heritage has significantly less items, 6% to Lewis, 13% to Wright and Lewis, and 81% to Wright. So I wonder what the difference is. It's almost like Heritage is seeing something that others are not, if you believe our strategy. So who made the Washington Lafayette medalette dies? Who made the oval medalette medallion dies? Kleberg, after we published our paper in the Numismatist, Kleberg wrote a rebuttal. That's fair. And he said, yeah, you're right, there are two medals, and Lewis did them both. Okay. Neil Massanti, in 2023, was giving a presentation to the ANS, and he said that Joseph Lewis did the oval medallions, and this fellow Giancarlo Persico did the medalettes and counterstamps, and that the counterstamps were struck at the U.S. Mint, and the medalettes struck later. And when he said later, he actually meant after Lafayette returned to France in 1825. I'm not going to go into it today, but we've done a die-state study all of these things were struck at the same time. There was not necessarily a order, but the dice dates suggest that they were all struck in about the same time frame. And there's evidence that the Washington die was beginning to have a problem. John Pack, in the Sidney Martin collection that they had recently, concluded, I mean, he had a 5,000 word auction description. I mean, 5,000 words is more words than the numismatist wants. But John says, no, it wasn't Lewis. But maybe it was Wright, or maybe it was Christian Gobert. Now, in 1824, Gobert was being hired by the Mint. And his expertise really at that time, I mean, the way he was recognized was his letter and numeral punches. So that was just kind of an interesting tidbit of information. Our conclusion, and it's spelled out in the numismatist article, is that the oval gold and silver medallions were Richard Trested and his apprentice, James Bell, and I'll have more to say about those two gentlemen. And the Washington Lafayette medalette dies were Charles Cushing Wright, Richard Trested, and James Bell. So when it comes to the attribution of the medalette, we've added two names. Why? Okay, hopefully I can explain that. One thing that we kept coming back on is that all die sinkers were engravers, but not all engravers were die sinkers. And Richard Trested is a well-known example of an engraver and die sinker. James Bell, his apprentice, who later became a partner with Charles Cushing Wright, an engraver, die sinker. Charles Cushing Wright, no explanation needed there. But John Lewis, even Ashby, Duran, J.D. Stout, the Persicos, both Giordano and Luigi, they're not medalists. They're sculptors. They lithograph small miniature portraits, but no one that has cut and sunk a die. Then in another 2023 A&S presentation, Massanti says, okay, Washington, Lafayette counterstamps were not the medallics described in Kleberg's 2008 A&S publication. However, he says Joseph Lewis did the oval medallion, and we are confused by this. But he offered no supporting evidence other than Kleberg's confounding analysis in his 2008 paper. Massanti, like I said before, suggests that the counterstamp dies were most likely Giordano Persico. I don't know where this name, I mean, I know where it came from, but I don't know the connection. Massanti offers the following as proof. He shows a picture of the counterstamped $50, 1824, and then an auction description. And in that auction description, this is from the James Longacre collection, struck during the visit of Lafayette to Philadelphia, very rare. The dies for these medallions and counterstamps were most likely the work of Persico, who had earlier prepared a bust of Lafayette. That's incorrect. Luigi, his brother, was the one who did the bust that is so famous. And then the dies in the counterstamp and medallions were almost certainly his work, struck at the Mint during Lafayette's visit. And sometime after that, the dies left the Mint and the medallions were struck elsewhere. At the bottom, that's the actual auction reference. Okay, so there is quite a bit of embellishment. The actual auction catalog says struck during the visit of Lafayette to Philadelphia. Very fine and rare. We got curious about, did Lafayette visit the Mint? Was there a presentation? Because one of the stories is that the 1824 half dollars were presentation pieces that were presented to dignitaries at the U.S. Mint on Lafayette's visit there. So Jack sent a letter off to the Philadelphia Mint, and this is the response. Stephen was very kind and to help us, and he reviewed 1824-25 correspondence. There's just no evidence that the Marquis of Lafayette ever visited the U.S. Mint. So once again, it's kind of the context of what is being said. And Neil says the counterstamps were struck at the Mint, but he offers no supporting evidence other than, I think these came out of the U.S. Mint in Philadelphia. But Lafayette didn't go to the Philadelphia Mint. In fact, Lafayette didn't even make it to Philadelphia until September the 28th, and there were already advertisements of these things being sold. I'm talking about the medalettes on the 25th. So the dates don't quite match. Well, who was Girano? He was a miniature portrait artist, a lithographer. Interesting family. Musante calls up this reference from Dave Bowers, and in 2000, Carl Malden informed Bowers that on December the 30th, 1824, Luigi Persico, a sculptor and artist, was paid $80 by the Philadelphia Mint for modeling a small medallion head of silver coins. And once that was seen, everybody thought this was the Lafayette portrait, or this was the Washington portrait. If you do a little more work, you come across a hidden newspaper article, and it describes in quite nice detail that Luigi Persico did do work for the Mint. He did a model, not a medal, but a model of Liberty. And once he had the model, he turned that over to the Mint for engraving, if they so chose. So Luigi is the one that Bowers has been referring to. I have no clue where the Girano reference is really coming from. And here just, yeah, I mean, it becomes quite clear that that Luigi was doing a rendition of Liberty. I know, you guys have probably written many more papers than I have. But one of the comments that Neil made, we in our numismatist paper, we showed this medal. It's the only signed medal by Richard Tresty. It's Simon Bolivar, 1824. We think it's a die trial. It's unique as far as we can tell. Appeared in an auction in, I think it was 1983, one of Paul Bosco's sales. But Mr. Musante says, we based our attribution to Tresty solely on the oval shape of the Bolivar medal, and then kind of lightheartedly said, you know, kind of based their assumption on this oval medal because it's oval, I guess. Well, that doesn't sit very well, you know. But he just didn't read our paper. You know, if you go back to our publication, you know, we go into this, and the only reason we put that portrait or that medal, because it's the only medal Tresty has signed, and yes, it's oval. You know, I don't know that there's any big deal about that. We think that's a die trial because it may have been modeled after a medal that a South American engraver, whose name escapes me right now, actually produced a medallion, and also the portrait was used on some coins. But sounds like old Lewis is getting the bad end of the deal. But he really shouldn't, because Lewis, we believe, is the instigator with the Castle Garden Committee. He's out to make a buck, and he knows that this celebration coming to New York City is huge. And this slide just basically shows the proximity. I know it's probably hard to see, but Trested, Stout, Lovett, Lewis, they were all in the same proximity in New York City. These guys were talking to each other, and they knew what was going on. I mean, this was not isolated events. The other interesting thing is, in over 39 years of business, Lewis never took an ad out in the New York City Directory except for 1824. I mean, that's how big of a commercial prospect things were. Now let's take a look at Trested, Bell, and Wright. It's important to understand the origins of the medallions, the medalette, and the counterstamps, and to realize, I mean, how many people in the room know who Richard Trested is? Have you ever heard of him? No hands. Okay. We, as well as several other authors, think that he's one of the most overlooked dice thinkers in the third decade of the 1800s. Premature death. Trested. Very nice paper, Nova Numismatics, talks about Trested and his contribution going forward after his death. The people that he interacted with, like I said, James Bell was his apprentice, and you'll see in a minute that Bell probably came from England with Trested. But you have other well-known people who basically got their start from him or his early work. Trested was born in England, 1792. He was an engraver in England prior to coming to this country. There's always been some question about, well, what did he do in England? Well, we found a reference, and this is from an insurance company, and they were providing insurance in 1818 and in 1819. He had two different business addresses. When I was talking to Nimosanti about this, Joe's response was, "Oh, that was his father. It wasn't him." These young men, by the age of 20, they were doing a lot of business. You know, they were not waiting until they were 30 because their lifespan wasn't quite that long. But unfortunately, the story goes that Trested lost a finger in probably a knuckle-like die machine. He was probably hand feeding, and he lost the finger. I don't know that exact date, but in less than a month, I think, he was dead. Infection. Okay. And that is in his obituary. So, Trested came to America. He came to America at a very interesting time because America was just getting cranking. I mean, we were just cranking up with metals and all of that technology. And I have this little idea that there may have been some British engravers that were helping him facilitate that move, because when he got to the States, or I'm sorry, to America, Let's see if I've got it here. Well, when he got to America, and just, I think he came over in 1820. 1821, he's advertising. 1823, he's making store cards. He's creating his own tokens. I mean, he hit the ground running, and where did he get all the resources? That was kind of one of the questions that kept coming up. In 1823, we have a new address, 68 William Street. Formerly it had been 70, and our gut feeling is this was not a move, but it was an expansion. That he was one of the go-to guys, and that was a reflection of his business. Okay, let's take a look at some portraits. You've seen the Trusted Boulevard, and I only put it here as just a point of reference. It's the only thing he signed. Another incredible story is the Lafayette medal says Bell, copy of Conoy's medal. This is an incredibly interesting story, and we are still developing it. But we think the link, as you'll see on the subsequent slide, that Bell actually doing this copy helped him with his portrait work. Okay, Trusted was not really well known for his portrait work as much as he was for his letter punching. But even his boulevard wasn't that bad. As far as Charles Cushing Wright goes, there's that unfinished work that Snowden referenced, and that picture is from his 1861 book. And you see these other profiles that we have of Wright's work of George Washington. And here's kind of our thinking. Those oval silver Lafayette medallions, you got to realize the technology here, I mean, those were gilded, the gold. Okay, these were not simple to make. If you're lucky enough to find one of the medallions that only has Lafayette on one side and the other side is blank, which we have one example that John Krelovich handled not too many years ago, probably that gold piece was peeled off and sold. So that had to be affixed. So I think even though our population is about 2 of the gold and silver and 2 of the silver, the gold required a lot more work. We think that Trusted and Bell, at Lewis's inspiration, made those medallions. And in the meantime, Charles Cushing Wright, which is a good buddy with Trusted and is referred to as a mentor for James Bell in many places. Maybe he encouraged Bell to copy the Conoy medal. Okay, brings up an entirely new can of worms. But with the Bell medal, with the unfinished Washington, we believe that you get to the medalette. And I don't want to read too much into this other than they look very similar. I mean, we've heard talks about matching letters and fonts and, and the characteristics of the portraits. But for us, the progression here from the medallion, not terribly sophisticated portrait, to something that's considerably better is the involvement of Wright. So circumstances and talent of the time, the cooperative effects between Trusted and Wright, The similarities in portrait designs, the lettering similarities between the oval medallion and the metal lead, and that's on the top. The light gray is the medallion, and the blue or purple represents the metalette. Now there's I kind of referred to it earlier, a triangle of corporation and location, but let's just look at Wright, Trested, and Vail. Wright and Trested were partners in a number of projects, a number of metals. Trested basically doing the lettering. Trested died early. At his death, Wright and Vail bought his business, bought his equipment, his punches. So if you see any familiarity with what Wright and Vail may have done post 33, you may find some similarities. But these guys tended to work together on various projects. And like I said, a number of authors refer to Vail as a student of Wright. To be honest, I've not seen that absolute connection, but the proximity is the thing that kind of drives that thought. So this is kind of how we view this process. Joseph Lewis was the driver. I think he was working with the Castle Garden Committee. He needed a badge medal. Who did he go to? He went to the biggest outfit in New York City at the time, and that would have been Richard Trested, even though you don't know anything about him. That's the interesting thing. Wright, Trested, and Vail, design, production. Lewis, Lovett, Stout, Anders, all these other guys in that same proximity, either in New York or through Lewis's knowledge of friends in Philadelphia, which would have been Anders, they were marketing this stuff. Someone asked us, why don't you find any advertisements for Charles Cushing Wright or Richard Trested? And the answer is, they were busy. They were making this stuff. They didn't need to advertise. They had their secondary market, and that basically was taking care of that. So just in kind of summary, there's no credible evidence to overturn the Wright attribution. It's just not there. You can question our addition of Trested and Vail, but as far as withdrawing the attribution from Wright, I don't think you can do it. And John McCoy, if you read about McCoy's 1864 sale, you realize what an numismatist he was. And we think that McCoy was the one who did the initial attribution. And then so much of the Kleberg and the Santis, it's just not backed up by any facts. It's hard to say you got to have facts, you got to have proof. Sometimes it's very difficult, but you got to have at least a little something to hang your hat on. And we just have not found it. The oval gold and silver medallions, which was a surprise to us, is Trested and Vail. And that was the discovery that we made reading Kleberg's paper. It was the observation that he had missed, and that Kleberg apparently has missed. So I appreciate your time, and acknowledgments. We have had so much help from the ANA and a Keogh list. This young man, I send him a note and say, I need a book. Do you have it? He says, oh yeah, I have it. He said, what are you interested in? I kind of tell him, and when I get the book, I get a whole bunch of other things that he's looked up for me. Just an incredible resource. And Martha and I met at Keogh when he was a YN. National Archives. We have, I say consultations. These are friends that have looked at this, and Emma Santi and I have had many conversations. Numismatic marketing, we're glad to have Leanna to help us with the book. American Friends of Lafayette has been a very interesting interaction, and then the ANS. And this is just where we go for some of our research. Not everything, but you can't read enough. So with that, I am done, and more than happy to answer some questions.
Questions? What, go ahead.
Back up a second and explain the difference between the engraver and the dice inker.
An engraver basically puts the picture on the metal, but he does not sink the die. In other words, you have to take the engraved and sink metal to get the impression. So that, and some people say, well, the engraving is, you don't have to have it on metal, you just have a picture, and that's correct too. But when we think about metallist, you basically have an outline on the metal, and then you have a second process that goes in with the punches or whatever to actually make it transferable to the metal. That get
Any
close?
other questions?
What kind of financial multiplier are you talking for those counterstamps on the $50, like cents, stuff like that? How much more expensive than those coins?
The last $50 that I'm aware of that sold for $26,000. You can buy a counterstamp large cent. I think recently they've been in the $3,000 range, depending on condition. So the $50, particularly in the high grade, they love them. Yeah, and there are not many of them. Yeah.
Thank you, Ron.
Oh, thank you.
What I didn't mention before, and I wanted to wait till after Ron was finished, was this was going to be a joint presentation with Ron and Jack Conner. Jack contacted me a couple of days before the convention and unfortunately said he was taken ill and would not be able to come. And he said, but don't worry, Dr. Ron is going to be able to handle this. And let me tell you, that was an understatement. Thank you very much. You did a wonderful presentation.
Something to say.